Introduction. How this book was written and why. Dealing with other people may be the single biggest problem you ever face. At work, at home, anywhere two lives meet. Dale Carnegie learned this not in a library but in a classroom. From 1912 he taught public speaking to working adults in New York, and season after season he noticed something. What they needed even more than poise on their feet was the everyday art of getting along with people. He points to a striking finding out of engineering of all fields. Only about 15% of a person's financial success comes from technical knowledge. The other 85% comes from skill in human engineering, from personality, and the ability to lead people. The oil magnate Rockefeller said it without flinching. The ability to deal with people is as purchasable a commodity as sugar or coffee, and he would pay more for it than for any other ability under the sun. Yet when Carnegie went looking for a practical handbook on human relations, he found none existed. So he built one. He read everything he could find, from the lives of Julius Caesar and Edison to more than 100 biographies of Theodore Roosevelt alone, and he interviewed famous inventors, politicians, and movie stars to learn how they actually handled people. The book did not get written so much as it grew. It began as a short talk and a handful of rules printed on a card no bigger than a postcard, and across 15 years of testing in the classroom it became this. These principles are not theory. Carnegie watched them remake lives. One employer who had spent years driving and condemning his 314 workers changed his approach, and, in his own words, turned 314 enemies into friends. The psychologist William James said that, compared with what we ought to be, we are only half awake, using a small fraction of our powers. This book sets out to wake them. And, as Carnegie promised, it is an action book. Part 1. Fundamental Techniques in Handling People. Chapter 1. If you want to gather honey, don't kick over the beehive. In 1931, New York police cornered a cop killer named Crowley in a Manhattan apartment, machine guns blazing. As he bled, he scrawled a note. Under his coat, he said, was a weary heart, but a kind one that would do nobody any harm. He went to the electric chair insisting he was only defending himself. Al Capone said much the same, that he had spent the best years of his life giving people pleasure, and got only abuse in return. The warden of Sing Sing prison confirmed it. Almost none of his inmates thought of themselves as bad men. Here is the unsettling lesson. If even hardened criminals never blame themselves, the ordinary people you and I are tempted to correct will almost never blame themselves either. Criticism is futile. It puts a person on the defensive and pushes them to justify themselves, and it wounds their pride and stirs resentment. The psychologist Skinner proved that animals rewarded for good behavior learn faster and remember more than animals punished for bad behavior, and the same is true of people. Lincoln learned this the hard way. As a young man, he loved to ridicule his opponents in print, until one humiliated rival challenged him to a duel. The fight was called off at the last moment, but Lincoln never mocked anyone again. Years later, when General Meade let a trapped Confederate army escape after Gettysburg, Lincoln sat down and wrote him a scorching letter. Meade never saw it. Lincoln filed it away unsent, for he had learned that sharp rebukes only end in resentment. The test pilot Bob Hoover once survived a crash caused by a mechanic who had fueled his plane with the wrong fuel. The young man was sick with shame. Hoover didn't scold him. He put an arm around him and asked him to service his plane the next day. Any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, and most fools do. It takes character and self-control to understand and forgive instead. Chapter 2. The Big Secret of Dealing with People. Andrew Carnegie once chose a man named Charles Schwab to run the newly formed United States Steel Company, and paid him more than $1 million a year. The figure had nothing to do with steel. Schwab freely admitted that many of his workers knew more about steel than he did. He was paid that fortune for his ability to deal with people. In his own words, his greatest asset was his power to arouse enthusiasm, and the way he did it was to be hearty in his approbation and lavish in his praise. There is the whole secret. The deepest craving in human nature, the psychologists agree, is the desire to feel important. Freud traced nearly everything we do to two motives, and one of them is the wish to be great. The philosopher John Dewey called it the desire to be important. William James said the deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated. We feed that hunger in our children and our friends, and then starve the grown-ups around us of the one thing they crave. Schwab fed that hunger, and so can anyone. But there is a line that must never be crossed, the line between appreciation and flattery. One is sincere, the other insincere. One comes from the heart out, the other from the teeth out. Flattery is cheap, selfish praise that discerning people see through at once, and it does more harm than good. Honest appreciation is something else entirely. It means genuinely looking for what is good in a person and telling them so. Stop thinking for a moment about your own accomplishments and try instead to figure out the other person's good points. Then give honest, sincere appreciation, and people will treasure your words and repeat them over a lifetime. Chapter 3. He who can do this has the whole world with him. He who cannot walks a lonely way. When Carnegie went fishing, he didn't bait the hook with the strawberries and cream he himself loved. He baited it with a worm because that is exactly what the fish wanted. People are no different when you want something from them. The only way on earth to influence anyone is to talk about what they want and show them how to get it. Carnegie once proved it on his own landlord. He rented a hotel ballroom for his lectures, and one season the manager warned him the rent would nearly triple. Instead of protesting, Carnegie sat down and listed the manager's own advantages and disadvantages. A ballroom freed up for dances and conventions would earn far more than lectures ever could, and the crowds his talks drew were worth more than thousands of dollars of advertising. Without once mentioning what he himself wanted, he got the increase cut from triple to barely half. The psychologist Harry Overstreet put the principle in a single line. Action springs from what we fundamentally desire, so the one who can arouse in another an eager want has the whole world with him, while the one who cannot walks alone. Henry Ford said much the same, that the great secret of success, if there is one, lies in the ability to see things from the other person's angle as well as your own. A father in Cleveland used it on his small son, who refused to go to kindergarten. Rather than argue, the parents made kindergarten look thrilling by finger painting at the kitchen table, and soon the boy was begging to go. None of this is manipulation. The point is not to trick someone into acting against their own interest, but to find the place where both of you win. Arouse in the other person an eager want, and doors that were shut swing open. Part 2. 6 Ways to Make People Like You. Chapter 1. Do this and you'll be welcome anywhere. You can win more friends in 2 months by becoming genuinely interested in other people than in 2 years by trying to get them interested in you. The proof trots around on 4 legs. A dog makes its whole living by showing interest in us. It is the one animal that never has to work, and it wins our love simply by being genuinely glad to see us. The magician Howard Thurston understood the same thing. For 40 years he reigned as the greatest magician in the world, and more than 60 million people paid to watch him. Other performers looked at the audience and thought, there's a bunch of suckers out there. Thurston thought differently. Before every show he stood in the wings and repeated to himself, I love my audience, I love my audience. Contrast that with how most of us behave. One study of telephone conversations found that the word we use most often is the word I. It turned up 3,900 times in 500 calls. The Viennese psychologist Alfred Adler named the cost of this. It is the person who is not interested in others who has the greatest difficulties in life and does the greatest harm to others. Theodore Roosevelt lived out the opposite every day. He greeted every White House servant by name, down to the kitchen maids, and asked after their families, and they adored him for it. The interest, though, has to be real. A show of interest works only when it is sincere, paying off for the one giving it and the one receiving it alike. When you stop angling for attention and simply give it, people open up, and you become welcome almost anywhere. Chapter 2. A simple way to make a good first impression. Actions speak louder than words, and a smile says, "I like you. You make me happy. I am glad to see you." Charles Schwab said his smile had been worth $1 million, and Carnegie thought even that was an understatement. The effect ripples outward. In a crowded, glum veterinarian's waiting room in Missouri, a baby smiled at an irritated man. He smiled back, struck up a conversation, and within minutes the whole room had thawed. But suppose you don't feel like smiling. Then, said the psychologist William James, act the part anyway. Feeling and action go together, and by regulating the action, which the will controls directly, you indirectly regulate the feeling. Force a cheerful manner, and cheerfulness tends to follow. One New York stockbroker, by his own account one of the worst grouches on Wall Street, forced himself to smile for a single week and said it transformed his marriage and his whole life. A smile travels even where it cannot be seen. One manager hired a candidate over the telephone because, he said, the voice sounded glad to hear from him. None of this means a fixed, mechanical grin. We all see through that and resent it. It has to be the real thing, a warmth that comes from the inside. As an old Chinese proverb has it, a person without a smiling face must not open a shop. Lincoln said most folks are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. Your smile is a small decision with outsized returns. Chapter 3. If you don't do this, you are headed for trouble. Jim Farley never finished grade school, yet he could greet 50,000 people by their first names, and that single talent helped carry Franklin Roosevelt into the White House. His method was simple. He made it his business to learn a name, fix it in memory, and use it. Most of us don't because we tell ourselves we are too busy, though we are surely no busier than a president. The lesson reaches all the way back to childhood. As a poor boy in Scotland, Andrew Carnegie caught a rabbit with a nest of young and nothing to feed them, so he offered the neighborhood children a deal. Gather enough clover and dandelions, and he would name a rabbit after each of them. It worked like magic, and he never forgot why. Years later, wanting to sell steel rails to the Pennsylvania Railroad, he built a mill and named it after the railroad's president, Edgar Thomson. When the railroad needed rails, you can guess whose it bought. Even Napoleon III, Emperor of France, made a ritual of it. If he missed a name, he asked the person to repeat it, then to spell it, then wrote it down and studied it before tearing up the paper. He took the time that most of us refuse to take. The reason this matters is that a person's name is, to that person, the sweetest and most important sound in any language. Forget it or spell it wrong, and you have put yourself at a quiet disadvantage. Remember it, and you have paid a compliment that costs nothing and is felt deeply. Chapter 4. An easy way to become a good conversationalist. At a dinner party, Carnegie once spent an entire evening with a botanist, listening, fascinated, as the man described exotic plants and even the humble potato. He said almost nothing himself. Yet the botanist later told their host that Carnegie was a most stimulating conversationalist. The truth was that he had simply been a good listener and had encouraged the man to talk. That is the whole trick, and it flatters people more than any compliment. Charles Eliot, who led Harvard for decades, said there is no mystery to it. Exclusive attention to the person speaking to you is the highest compliment you can pay. Listening can disarm even fury. A New York telephone company once sent a troubleshooter to a customer who had been screaming at them for months and threatening lawsuits. The man simply let the customer pour it all out, hour after hour, agreeing as he went, and the customer ended up paying every bill and dropping his complaints. What he had wanted all along was a feeling of importance, and being heard gave it to him. Even Freud, by one account, listened with such quiet, genial attention that people felt utterly understood. The opposite habit makes enemies fast. If you want people to avoid you, the recipe is easy. Never listen for long, talk endlessly about yourself, and interrupt the moment a thought occurs to you. The person who talks only about themselves thinks only about themselves. So encourage others to talk about themselves, and give them your complete, undivided attention. It is one of the highest compliments we can pay, and one of the rarest. Chapter 5. How to Interest People. Everyone who ever visited Theodore Roosevelt came away astonished by the range of his knowledge. The secret was simple. The night before a guest arrived, Roosevelt sat up late reading about whatever that person cared about most. He understood that the royal road to a person's heart is to talk about the things they treasure most. A scout leader named Chalif put this to work. He needed a busy executive to fund a single boy's trip to a jamboree in Europe, and he had heard that the man once wrote a check for $1 million and then framed it. So when Chalif walked in, he never mentioned the Boy Scouts at all. He asked with real curiosity to see that famous check. He admired it and let the man relive the whole story behind it. Only then did the executive ask what Chalif had come for, and he gave far more than was requested, sending 5 boys to Europe, paying the way, and keeping Chalif abroad for 7 weeks. Talking in terms of the other person's interests pays both sides. The other person feels seen, and you, as one of Carnegie's students put it, enlarge your own life a little with every such conversation. So before you ask anyone for anything, find out first what lights them up, and start there. Lead with their interests, not your own agenda, and you will rarely be turned away. Chapter 6. How to Make People Like You Instantly. There is one law that, faithfully obeyed, brings countless friends. Always make the other person feel important. Carnegie tested it in the dullest of places, a post office queue. To a bored clerk weighing his letter he said, "Sincerely, I wish I had your head of hair." The man lit up, and the small exchange brightened them both. Carnegie wanted nothing at all from him. He simply offered a scrap of honest appreciation. The same move can close a fortune. When the businessman James Adamson wanted a $90,000 order for theater seats, he met George Eastman, the inventor who built Kodak. Warned to keep it to 5 minutes, Adamson instead admired Eastman's beautiful office and asked about his life and his philanthropies. Eastman moved, talked for 2 hours, and the friendship lasted for years. Sometimes the gift turns out to be literal. A lawyer visiting his wife's lonely old aunt took the trouble to admire her house and her treasures honestly, and she, starved for appreciation, ended up giving him her prized automobile rather than leave it to relatives who were merely waiting for her to die. The columnist Dorothy Dix once asked a jailed swindler how he had won so many women, and his answer was simple: talk to a person about themselves. Disraeli said the very same thing. This is really the golden rule in action. Give to others the feeling of importance you would want for yourself. But it has to be honest. Cheap flattery fails. Sincere appreciation, the kind that looks hard for something true to admire, never does. Make the other person feel important and mean it. Part 3. How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking. Chapter 1. You Can't Win an Argument. Early in his career at a banquet, Carnegie confidently corrected a man who had misattributed a quotation, insisting it came from Shakespeare and not the Bible. He even appealed to a Shakespeare scholar at the table to settle it. To his shock, the scholar kicked him under the table and declared the other man right. Walking home, the scholar admitted Carnegie had been correct, but then asked why he should humiliate a man by proving him wrong. Carnegie had gained nothing but the man's resentment. There it is, you cannot really win an argument. Lose it and you lose, win it and you still lose because you have wounded the other person's pride and made an enemy. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Take a hot-tempered truck salesman named Pat, who loved a good fight and antagonized every buyer he met. The day he learned to stop contradicting customers and start agreeing with them, he became a star. Benjamin Franklin saw it long before. Win an argument by rankling and contradicting, he wrote, and your victory is empty, because you will never get the other person's goodwill. So welcome the disagreement, distrust your first defensive impulse, and listen first. Look for the points where you already agree. When you are tempted to tell someone they are flatly wrong, remember that the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. Chapter 2. A sure way of making enemies and how to avoid it. You can tell people they are wrong with a look, a tone, a gesture, and the moment you do, you have struck at their intelligence and their pride, and they will want to strike back. No argument of fact will move them because you have bruised their feelings. A lumber salesman named Crowley once faced a buyer rejecting an entire carload as below grade. Instead of arguing, Crowley went to the yard and simply asked friendly questions as the inspector tossed pieces aside. Bit by bit it emerged that the inspector was applying the rules for hardwoods to white pine, which he didn't really know. Crowley never said the word wrong. He just kept asking. And the inspector re-inspected, accepted the whole load, and sent a check in full. Benjamin Franklin cured himself of bluntness with a rule. Never contradict directly, never say certainly or undoubtedly. Instead he learned to say, I conceive or I imagine or it seems to me. There is a magic phrase for these moments. I may be wrong. I frequently am. Let's examine the facts. Almost no one can fight it. Remember that it is rarely the idea itself that people defend. It is their self-esteem, the little word my dinner, my dog, my country. Even Theodore Roosevelt said that if he could be right 75% of the time, he would reach the height of his hopes. So show respect for the other person's opinions. Never tell them they are wrong. Chapter 3. If you're wrong, admit it. Carnegie used to walk his little bulldog, Rex, in the park with no leash and no muzzle. One day a mounted policeman caught him at it for the second time. Carnegie didn't wait for the lecture. Officer, he said, you've caught me red-handed.
I'm guilty.
I have no alibis, no excuses. The policeman, disarmed, found himself softening. Well, he said, it's a temptation to let a little dog run out here. Carnegie kept condemning himself, and the more he did, the more generous the officer grew, until the man let him go with a smile. Here is why that worked so well. The policeman, being human, wanted a feeling of importance. Once Carnegie began condemning himself, the only way left for the officer to feel important was to show mercy. When we are wrong, and we will be wrong surprisingly often, if we are honest, let's admit it fast, openly, and with enthusiasm. Say about yourself every harsh thing the other person is preparing to say, and say it first. You take the wind out of their sails. A commercial artist named Warren tried it on a furious art editor. He simply agreed he had blundered and was ashamed of himself. The editor, with nothing left to attack, ended up defending the work, paying him and handing him a new job. There is an old truth in it. By fighting, you never get enough, but by yielding, you get more than you expected. Chapter 4. A drop of honey. Lincoln liked to say that a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. The same holds for people. If you would win someone to your cause, first convince them that you are their friend. When 2,500 workers struck the White Motor Company, demanding higher wages and a union shop, the company president did the unthinkable. He didn't threaten or condemn. He praised the strikers publicly for the peaceful way they had laid down their tools, bought them baseball bats and gloves, and rented them a bowling alley. Friendliness did what friendliness always does. It bred more friendliness. The strikers borrowed brooms and tidied up the factory grounds, and the strike ended within a week, with no rancor on either side. Aesop knew this 26 centuries ago. In his fable, the wind and the sun argue over who can make a traveler remove his coat. The harder the wind blows, the tighter the man clutches it. Then the sun shines warmly, and he takes it off himself. Gentleness and friendliness beat fury and force every time. Woodrow Wilson put it plainly. Come at me with your fists doubled, and mine will double just as fast. But say, let us sit down and take counsel together, and we will find we are not so far apart. Scolding and domineering never change a mind. So begin in a friendly way, the warmth is what opens the door. Chapter 5. Get the other person saying yes, yes immediately. When you start a conversation, don't begin with the things you disagree on. Begin by emphasizing and keep emphasizing the things on which you agree. Get the other person nodding yes from the very start, because once they have said no, pride locks them into staying consistent with it. The psychologist Overstreet described a no as a full-body refusal. The whole organism braces against you. A yes, by contrast, sets everything moving in your direction. Socrates built his entire method on this. The gadfly of Athens never told people they were wrong. He asked only questions they had to agree with, one small yes after another, until they had granted his conclusion almost without noticing. A salesman named Allison used the same path with a stubborn engineer who complained that a batch of motors ran too hot to touch. Rather than argue, Allison got him to agree, step by step, that a well-built motor does run warm, that the room itself was already warm, until the engineer reached the conclusion himself that the motors were fine. He then ordered tens of thousands of dollars more. A bank teller kept a wavering customer the same way, asking only the questions the man would gladly answer yes to. He who treads softly goes far. So open on agreement, ask the questions that earn an early yes, and let the momentum carry you the rest of the way. Chapter 6. The safety valve in handling complaints. Let the other person do most of the talking. They know their own business and problems far better than you do, so ask them questions and let them tell you. A salesman once arrived to bid on a huge upholstery contract with a throat so raw he could barely whisper. He scribbled on a pad, "Gentlemen, I have lost my voice, I am speechless." So the company president did the talking for him, praised the fabric, argued the salesman's own case better than the salesman could have. He walked out with an order for over $1.5 million, the biggest of his life, won almost entirely by keeping quiet. The truth is that people can't be sold, you have to let them buy. An electric company man learned it with a skeptical farm wife who waved off every pitch. Instead of selling, he admired her prize flock of hens and asked about her eggs. And before long she was telling him how electric light in the henhouse would pay for itself. He let her sell herself. Even our friendships run on this. A French moralist put it well. If you want enemies, excel your friends. But if you want friends, let your friends excel you. When we let others outshine us, they feel important. When we trumpet our own triumphs, we breed envy. So talk less. Ask, listen, and let the other person do a great deal of the talking. Chapter 7. How to get cooperation. We trust our own ideas far more than ideas handed to us on a platter. So the wise move is to make a suggestion, then step back and let the other person reach the conclusion as if it were their own. A sketch artist named Wesson had called on one New York stylist every week for 3 years. 150 visits, 150 refusals. Then he changed his whole approach. He carried in a few half-finished sketches and asked the buyer to tell him how to complete them so they would be useful. The buyer did, kept them a few days, finished them to his own taste, and bought them all. As Wesson put it, I didn't sell him, he bought. Colonel House influenced President Wilson the same way. He would drop an idea casually, so it lodged in Wilson's mind, and then wait. Later Wilson would announce that very idea as his own. House didn't care who got the credit, he wanted results. Emerson saw the principle clearly. In every work of genius, he wrote, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a borrowed grandeur. 25 centuries earlier, The sage Lao Tzu said the sea rules 100 mountain streams because it lies below them. So plant the seed, then let the other person grow it. Let them feel the idea is theirs, and they will defend it as their own. Chapter 8. A formula that will work wonders for you. Other people may be completely wrong, but they don't think so. Don't condemn them, try to understand them. There is a formula that works wonders. Before you speak, honestly ask yourself, how would I feel, how would I react, if I were in their shoes? A man named Sam spent 4 years scoffing at his wife's devotion to the lawn. All that fertilizing and mowing, he thought, for grass that looked no better than the day they moved in. The arguments ruined many an evening. Then it dawned on him that the work simply relaxed her and made her happy. He started pulling weeds beside her and complimenting her, and one evening of weeding opened the door to a far warmer marriage. He had learned to see the thing from her side. The Harvard Dean Donham gave a striking rule. He would rather walk the sidewalk for 2 hours before an interview, he said, than walk in unprepared. He wanted a clear idea of what he would say and of how the other person was likely to answer. That habit, pausing to grasp the other viewpoint, is worth more than all the cleverness in the world. By becoming curious about the cause of someone's behavior, you grow far less likely to resent the effect. So try honestly to see things from the other person's point of view. It may be the one stepping stone that carries your whole career. Chapter 9. What everybody wants. There is a phrase that stops arguments dead, erases ill will, and makes people listen. Here it is: I don't blame you one bit for feeling as you do. If I were you, I would feel exactly the same. Say it and mean it, because it is almost always true. The other person's heredity and experience made them who they are, just as yours made you. 3 out of 4 people you meet are hungering for sympathy. Give it to them and they will love you. Carnegie once told a radio audience that the author of Little Women lived in the wrong place, and got the state wrong too, and was deluged with furious letters. One woman's note was especially scalding. Instead of firing back, he telephoned her, apologized and sympathized with her anger, and by the end she was apologizing to him and asking to know him better. The great impresario Hurok managed temperamental stars for decades, and said the secret was sympathy, sympathy, and more sympathy. When his famous singer would call at noon claiming his throat felt like raw hamburger, Hurok never argued. He rushed over, dripping with sympathy, until the man agreed to sing. The psychologists confirm it. Sympathy is something the human species universally craves. We display our injuries from childhood on, fishing for the comfort of being understood. So be sympathetic with the other person's ideas and desires. Costs you nothing, and it neutralizes the acid of hard feelings like nothing else. Chapter 10. An appeal that everybody likes. The banker Pierpont Morgan observed that a person usually has 2 reasons for doing a thing, one that sounds good, and the real one. People act on the real reason, but they love to think of themselves as acting on the noble one. So if you want to change someone, appeal to their nobler motives. A collections man named Thomas was sent after 6 customers who flatly refused to pay their car service bills. The credit department had already told them, bluntly, that they were wrong. Thomas tried the very opposite tack. He visited each one, listened, conceded they probably knew their own cars best, and said, in effect, I trust you to settle this fairly. Whatever you say goes. 5 of the 6 paid in full, and all 6 bought new cars within 2 years. The appeal to honor works on the proud as well. When a newspaper kept running a photograph he disliked, the press baron Northcliffe didn't complain that he hated it. He wrote, simply, please stop running that picture. My mother doesn't like it. No one argues with a man's love for his mother. Assume that the person you are dealing with is honest, fair, and wants to do the right thing, and most people will rise to meet that flattering assumption. So appeal to the nobler motives. People work hard to live up to the good opinion you hold of them. Chapter 11. The movies do it. Advertisers do it. The title asks, why don't you do it? It isn't enough to state a truth, you have to make it vivid, dramatic, and alive. The movies do it, advertisers do it, and so should you. A market researcher named Boynton had a thick report on a cold cream brand, and his first meeting collapsed into a dull argument over methods. On his second try, he dramatized. He walked in, opened a bag, and set 32 jars of competing cold cream on the buyer's desk, each one tagged with the findings. The argument vanished. A 10-minute appointment stretched to a full hour because the facts were suddenly something you could see and touch. When a Philadelphia newspaper was accused of carrying too much advertising and too little news, it didn't issue a denial. It printed one ordinary day's news as a book, 307 pages of it, and let the sheer size make the point. A salesman who wanted a grocer to upgrade his cash registers threw a handful of pennies on the floor and said, "You are throwing away money every time a customer goes through your line." People remember the show long after they forget the speech. So don't just tell people, show them. Dramatize your ideas, and watch dull facts suddenly command attention. Chapter 12. When nothing else works, try this. Charles Schwab once had a mill that kept missing its quota. Coaxing failed, swearing failed, and the threat of firing failed. So at shift change, he asked the day crew how many batches of steel they had made that day. 6, they said. Without a word, Schwab chalked a big 6 on the floor and walked off. The night shift saw it, asked what it meant and rubbed it out, chalking a 7 in its place. The day crew came in, saw the 7, and roared back with a 10. Soon that lagging mill was outproducing every other one in the plant. Schwab had tapped something deeper than greed. The desire to excel, the love of the game, the chance to prove your worth and win. People will work for a paycheck, but they pour themselves out for a challenge. The tire maker Firestone said he never found that pay alone could hold good people. It was the game itself. Decades later, the behavioral scientist Herzberg studied thousands of workers and reached the same conclusion. The single greatest motivator is not money or conditions, but the work itself, the chance to excel at it. So when reason and reward and kindness have all failed, throw down a challenge. To people of spirit, that is almost impossible to resist. Part 4. Be a leader. How to change people without giving offense or arousing resentment. Chapter 1. If you must find fault, this is the way to begin. It is always easier to hear hard truths after a little praise. A barber lathers a man before he shaves him. In 1863, in the darkest stretch of the Civil War, Lincoln had to rein in a headstrong general named Hooker. He could have torn into him. Instead, he opened his famous letter with praise. "I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier," he wrote, before naming gently the things that troubled him and closing, "Beware of rashness, but go forward and give us victories." The criticism landed, but it landed on a cushion. Picture a contractor sent to a customer notorious for finding fault. Rather than attack, he praised the man's spotless factory, the cleanest he had ever seen, and walked away with his delivery on time, without ever once demanding it. Beginning with praise is like the dentist who starts with Novocaine. The patient still gets the drilling, but the pain is dulled. The point is not to flatter and then pounce. It is to let the other person keep their footing while you tell them what must change. So if you must find fault, begin with honest praise and sincere appreciation. The unpleasant truth slides in far more easily once you do. Chapter 2. How to criticize and not be hated for it. Charles Schwab was walking through his steel mill one noon when he found several men smoking directly under a no-smoking sign. He didn't point at the sign and snap at them to read it. He handed each man a cigar and said, "I'd appreciate it, boys, if you'd smoke these outside." They knew that he knew, and they loved him for letting it go unspoken. That is the art, calling attention to a mistake indirectly, so no one has to lose face. Many of us blunt our praise with one little word, but. Your work is excellent, but. And the moment that but arrives, the listener stops believing the praise and braces for the blow. Change one word and the spell holds. Your work is excellent, and if you keep building on it, it will be better still. Now the praise is real, and the suggestion rides in on its goodwill. The wife of a famous minister once stopped her husband from preaching a dull sermon, not by calling it dull, but by musing that it would make a fine magazine article. He took the hint and started over. So call attention to people's mistakes indirectly. The lightest touch changes the most. Chapter 3. Talk about your own mistakes first. It is far easier to hear about your faults if the person criticizing humbly admits their own first. Carnegie's 19-year-old niece, Josephine, came to New York to be his secretary, and she made plenty of mistakes. But before correcting her, he learned to say, "You've made a mistake, Josephine, but heaven knows, it's no worse than many I've made myself. When I was your age, I did far sillier things." Hearing that, she could take the correction without flinching. History offers an even sharper lesson. The German Chancellor von Bülow once had to handle a Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who had made foolish public statements and now wanted his chancellor to take the blame. Von Bülow refused, and worse, implied the Kaiser had been silly to say such things, which only enraged him. Had von Bülow opened instead by humbling himself and praising the Kaiser, all would have been well. He learned it the hard way. Admitting your own mistakes, even ones you haven't yet fixed, can move another person to change, because you have made yourself an ally rather than a judge. So before you criticize anyone, talk honestly about where you have fallen short. It turns a rebuke into a confession shared between equals. Chapter 4. No one likes to take orders. Owen Young, who founded the Radio Corporation of America, never gave anyone a direct order in his life. A man who shared an office with him for 3 years said he never once heard him command. Young suggested he did not dictate. He would say, "You might consider this," or ask whether that would work. After dictating a letter, he would ask what you thought of it. He let people do things themselves and learn from their own mistakes. A question does what an order never can. It saves the other person's pride, it lets them feel important, and it makes them want to cooperate instead of rebel. When a factory manager in South Africa faced a rush order he doubted his team could fill, he didn't crack the whip. He gathered his people and asked whether there was any way to handle it, and whether they might adjust their hours. The ideas poured out, the workers took it on as their own challenge, and the order shipped on time. People are far more willing to carry out a decision they had a hand in making. So ask, don't command. Replace the order with a question, and you turn grudging obedience into willing partnership. Chapter 5. Let the other person save face. How often we trample on other people's feelings, when a few minutes' thought and a kinder word would spare them. General Electric faced a delicate problem. Steinmetz, a genius with electricity, was hopeless as the head of a department, yet far too valuable and too sensitive to offend. So the company simply gave him a new title, consulting engineer, for the work he was already doing, and quietly put someone else in charge of the department. Steinmetz was happy, and so was the company. They had moved their most temperamental star without a storm, by letting him save face. Even when we are completely right and the other person completely wrong, we gain nothing by making them lose face, we only wound their ego. An accountant who had to let seasonal staff go learned to begin by praising their work. That tough assignment in Newark you handled so well, so they left with their dignity intact and came back gladly the next season. A French aviator and writer said it best. I have no right to say or do anything that diminishes a person in their own eyes. What matters is not what I think of them, but what they think of themselves. So let the other person save face. costs you nothing, and it preserves something they will never forget you for protecting. Chapter 6. How to spur people on to success. Abilities wither under criticism. They blossom under encouragement. The young Charles Dickens, sneered at and poor, mailed his first story in the dead of night so no one would see him do it. Story after story came back rejected, until one editor accepted a piece. He paid nothing, but he praised it. Dickens walked the streets with tears rolling down his cheeks. That single word of recognition changed the whole course of his life. A boy named Caruso was told by his first teacher that he had no voice at all, that he sounded like wind in the shutters. But his mother believed in him and praised him, and he became the greatest opera singer of his age. The lesson is not to gush, but to notice, to praise the slightest improvement, specifically and sincerely. A trainer of performing dogs rewarded every small step in the right direction with a pat and a bit of meat. We somehow use far less imagination with people than with dogs. Praise, the psychologists say, is like sunlight to the human spirit. We cannot flower without it. So praise the slightest improvement, and praise every improvement. Be hearty in your approbation and lavish in your praise, and watch people grow toward the good you name in them. Chapter 7. Give a dog a good name. There is an old saying, give a dog a bad name and you may as well shoot him. The reverse is just as true. Give a person a fine reputation, and they will strain every nerve to live up to it. A fourth-grade teacher inherited the school's most notorious troublemaker, a boy everyone called Terrible Tommy. On the first day she looked him in the eye and said, "Tommy, I hear you're a born leader. I'm going to count on you to help me make this the best class in the whole grade." Over the next days she kept reminding him of his fine reputation, and a 9-year-old simply could not let her down, and he didn't. A service manager used the same move on a once excellent mechanic whose work had gone sloppy. Rather than scold him, he said, "Bill, you've always been one of the finest mechanics I've had," and the man's pride did the rest. His work grew careful and quick again. Shakespeare wrote, "Assume a virtue if you have it not." Act as though the good trait you want were already there. Give the person a reputation worth protecting, and they will go to astonishing lengths not to disappoint you. So give the other person a fine reputation to live up to. Chapter 8. Make the faults seem easy to correct. Tell a person they are hopeless at something, and you have killed their desire to try. Do the opposite. Make the thing look easy, let them know you believe they can do it, and they will practice until dawn. A man named Jones took in his teenage son David, a boy a car accident had scarred and the schools had written off as brain injured. At 15 he still could not do his multiplication tables. So his father turned it into a game. Flashcards, a stopwatch, and a loud celebration of every card the boy got right. The first night took 52 minutes. Within a month David ran through them all perfectly in under 8 and went on to make the honor roll. He had made the wonderful discovery that learning could be easy and even fun. Carnegie tells of taking dancing lessons from 2 teachers. The first told him bluntly that he was all wrong, and took the heart out of him. The second told him his sense of rhythm was natural and he was a born dancer. She may have been flattering him, he admits, but he believed it and he danced better. Encouragement works because faith is contagious. So use encouragement, and make the faults seem easy to correct. People rise to the level of the confidence you place in them. Chapter 9. Make people glad to do what you want. People do most willingly the things they are glad to do. So the leader's task is to frame a request so the other person actually wants to grant it, to find what they get out of saying yes. In 1915, President Wilson needed to send a peace envoy to wartime Europe, and his Secretary of State longed for the job. Wilson chose someone else, but his advisor, Colonel House, broke the news so deftly that the snubbed man felt flattered. The mission, he was told, was best done quietly, since his own going would attract far too much attention. In other words, he was too important for it, and he went away satisfied. Titles and honors are astonishingly powerful. Napoleon created the Legion of Honor, handed out 15,000 medals, and made 18 of his generals marshals of France. Mocked for giving his veterans toys, he answered, "Men are ruled by toys." A father got his reluctant son to gather fallen pears by paying him for each full basket and docking him for any left behind, and the boy worked happily. A manager cured a careless clerk by making him supervisor of price tags for the whole store. So find a way for the other person to gain a little recognition, a reward, a sense of importance, and they will be glad to do what you ask. That is the heart of leadership.